Does it really feel like a step forward, or is it more like marketing than substance?
We have billions of people using it, which means more data, which means more corrections, right? But that's using that as a benchmark versus saying to what degree has it become more contextually and culturally, sensitive and adapted. But indeed, these messiahs do, inflate not just their creation, but overinflate what technologies are doing, good and bad, and understate what human agency can do in shaping these tools.
This is In Focus, and I'm Anupama Chandrasekaran. In August, OpenAI released GPT-5, that stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer, which, let's be honest, sounds less like a chatbot and more like a Marvel superhero. Sam Altman, its CEO, says talking to GPT-5 is like talking to someone with a PhD. It's faster, sharper, supposedly more useful, and yet with each upgrade, the doubts grow louder. Some say it feels less like a revolution, more like a rebrand. Altman himself is never far away from the spotlight. He's at the center of a new book by journalist Karen Howe that asks whether this AI boom has the ethical leadership it needs. And beyond the hype lie tougher questions about privacy, about the invisible, underpaid workers who train these systems, about the energy they burn, and about who really gains from all of this. To help us think this through, I'm joined today by Payal Arora. She's a digital anthropologist and professor of inclusive AI cultures at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. She's also the author of The Next Billion Users, and her new book, From Pessimism to Promise, looks at what the global south can teach us about building more inclusive technology. Welcome, Payal, to In Focus.
Thanks so much. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation, which is obviously very relevant.
Payal, can you start by telling us a little bit about, your work? And for people who don't know it, who is a digital anthropologist?
Sure. Look, digital anthropology is just a fancy way of saying that I study how people use and experience digital technologies in their everyday life, right? And so I've been doing this for the last 2 decades, talking to young people, particularly in, marginalized settings in India, Brazil, Kenya, and other parts, which led me to my Next Billion Users book. And that's really the heart of it. Is it's not just young people, it's the majority world who are in precarious conditions. They are, upwardly mobile in aspiration and, in ways of connecting as global citizens. So I want to capture that ethos because it's also how you feel towards technologies, which actually have material impact. It has experiential impact, and we can talk more about that.
Right. OpenAI released its latest version of ChatGPT last month. From your perspective, does it really feel like a step forward, or is it more like marketing than substance?
Obviously, they want to build a big deal out of it because with each iteration, they are also competing with more and more large language models coming out, right? Which are actually competing with them. So they have to make it a big deal to say, hey, we are still number one. We still have not just a first mover advantage, we are the first, right? In true America first, America only. Use us and you'll be happy. Exactly. But the point is that every technology is always iterative. There's no such thing as a static technology. So sure, in terms of computational improvements, it's gotten more data for obvious reasons. We have billions of people using it, which means more data, which means more corrections, right? But that's using that as a benchmark versus saying to what degree has it become more contextually and culturally, sensitive and adapted, right? And I think that's a much better benchmark because then we can talk about quality, we can talk about, adaptability, and we can talk about usability in a genuine way, which actually respects the dignity of context and cultures, particularly in the majority world.
I mean, I like the fact that you spoke about usability because that kind of becomes a kind of an important part of this discussion, right? So when people use tools like ChatGPT, how does it change, since you are an anthropologist and you're looking at, the intersection of this digital revolution and the way humans respond to it, how does it change the way we think about, say, intelligence or creativity or even the way we interact with machines?
Yeah, there's a sort of an obsession that intelligence is firstly intrinsic, right? And it's output oriented. I think these are the two um, very large dominant tropes in the way in which we conceive intelligence. And so it's also very Western centric. There's very individualistic, that I have the intelligence and I have the capital to be able to, justify why I am much more successful than, say, you, right? Or the other person. Versus if we look at intelligence as a sort of a collective, right? Where we together as a society move forward, right? In the ways in which we think. Like, for example, what was the norm of like a century ago was women are not good in medicine, right? So because they faint the drop of blood. Today, actually, in the Netherlands, there are more women doctors in general practice. In fact, diversity initiatives are to try to get boys into the classroom because boys across the world are not doing as well as girls, right? And particularly women are very good at caregiving, and also in these kinds of spaces are really making fast headway. So that to me is a cultural intelligence which is meaningful in the shift in our worldview, shift in our thinking, right? And also in terms of output oriented, is like, I've produced this product, which is mine, right? Versus acknowledging that I've built on the intelligence, not just of my peers, of my people, but also of a history and legacy of practice, which means that you have to give fair, shared value. So I think if we can rethink intelligence in those terms, we can address other more pertinent questions when it comes to what's happening with AI and everyday data and everyday use.
Right. And I guess what you're saying over here is that, while these products that are being churned out are kind of interesting and perhaps in some ways path-breaking, but they are built on legacy of human knowledge, right? From a variety of spaces, and that has to be acknowledged. Definitely being trained on large amounts of human content. What should we be asking then about privacy, consent, and also the ethics of using that personal data or public data?
It is important for us to remember, particularly those in the global south, is that 90% of young people live in the global south, and they're the most active, most enthusiastic. So the normative is the global south. We are the majority users. We are the data producers. So we shouldn't be asking. We are claiming that this is ours, right? And, times have changed. I think basically the global south of yesterday is not the global south of today. You see what's happening with the whole, Trumpian style of America only, America first, etc. moves in terms of, isolationism in a way, inward looking, like America is Silicon Valley is the prime domain of the space, and that includes ChatGPT. And people forget that Sam Altman used to actually have a organization called WorldCoin. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but that basically was him promising, money for the whole humanity, which is typical of Silicon Valley, right? In terms of WorldCoin, as long as they gave them, their iris scans and their fingerprints and other kind of biometric data. And so that lasted only a couple of years. It went bankrupt. It didn't happen because it was an experiment that failed. It was deliberately sort of, designed to fail. If you see the legacy of Silicon Valley practices, which start with tech for good, AI altruism, and then fail, and then people don't question what happened to all that data. And
even move for profit, right? They move into being for profit as well.
Exactly. And this is a pathway, by the way. This is a well-trodden pathway to, claiming in the name of altruism data which is not yours, right? In terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of doing good. So the bottom line is the global south is coming up with their own local data initiatives, building their own language models, looking at specific data for specific context. So it's applied, which means it doesn't require, massive general data models, right? So their real shift, and it's open source, and It's a different kind of ethos, which is also geopolitically, fostering new kinds of alliances, particularly as a pushback against this sort of American, strong handling of the rest of the world, right?
Right. So you're saying that, there is enough happening locally in the global south that could counter this kind of, capitalist intentions of, these large language, uh, processes and systems that are kind of being created. Yeah. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, just look at the focus is on large, right? It's true. America's bigger is better logic, which it's sort of exposed to the rest of the world versus the smallest beautiful model, right? Which is like a beautiful book from Schumacher from the past, which still, and, if you think about in India itself, the whole Gandhian logic, which can be reclaimed is that, it's about applying it. It's like a niche is scalable. We have such a rich culture and context. And in the past, it was looked upon as a liability because you're thinking about English language users. You're thinking about an American mindset of scalability, saying, this is not worth us customizing it for this random language, which is not useful for me. Today, it's a different thing because you can also build, even without knowing how to code, to basically build content which really is relevant for you, because we don't need to know everything and anything. We don't need 100,000 choices oftentimes, right? It's really a very toxic logic that, if I have 20 brands of toothpaste, I'm better off than 3 brands, versus talking about quality data sets. And quality comes from, is it speaking to my concerns, my interests, what I am going through as a group, as a community that has long been neglected? And if it's not, then however big it is not meaningful for me, right? And we have to have that kind of conversation.
Yeah. So no, I completely agree with you about this need for quality data and not really kind of relying too much on the way, the Western countries are analyzing this data and running it, and more customization, more decentralization. That makes total sense. Now, looking at the environmental issues related to running these large AI models, a huge amounts of electricity, water is used to run these data centers. How should we balance those environmental costs against the benefits AI is set to bring? And of course, a lot of these data centers are being set up in, developing countries too. So what do you have to say about that in terms of the environment and the way AI models are kind of using up all our resources?
So, it is very difficult because what we're talking about is 2 very powerful movements: data justice and climate justice, right? So climate justice, where the global south is disproportionately impacted by the climate changes around us. And while the West uses majority of the world's resources and produces the majority of, carbon and other kinds of, toxic chemicals and impacting our planetary health, the global south actually absorbs most of that impact, right? So that climate justice is pushing for the global north to basically account for their actions. And the data justice is saying that, well, we've been lagging behind, so-called, the digital divide race. And that framing has been very toxic because always catching up to the West, but more about building meaningful technologies for our context, which finally, like I said, we're not just, taking and borrowing, we're building our own homegrown. And this is happening in Africa and Brazil and China, of course, as you've seen with DeepSeek. And, interestingly, China has been inspirational for that, right? Because DeepSeek came about and said, you don't have to have billions of venture capital funding. You don't need to have this insane amount of data to build, and not just build, but actually create like competitive and alternative models, which are open source, which sees culture and language and the ways we speak and the ways we think as assets and not liabilities. So it was a game changer, and it gave a lot of hope, including for Europe, who is also like basically struggling with the American style politic where, has given rise to a lot of European data sovereignty conversations and actions, right? So all this put together, of course, I am quite enthusiastic about the fact that we have power in numbers because, like I said, majority of the world lives in the global south. The best thing that has happened to the global south is Trump, because it has unified all of us to put aside our differences. But we have to be cautious because, we have to also understand, as you see the optics, right, about how the BRICS came together in China a few days ago, all male. And where are the women? Half the world's population. We, let's not romanticize the global south. We tend to also share a deeply patriarchal structure. And so women have to be at the table. In fact, there should ideally be more women because we have been, pushed in the sides for the longest time, and we've been bearing the burden of sustaining these economies through our work, including, data work, right? So all this put together is we need to do things differently and not, age-old practices, which will then address, data-like technologies, because if we come together, we can build data-like technologies which can actually leverage on limited resources, but also democratize our systems which are not democratic, like education, healthcare. So imagine like being able to use a small language model in your own language, right, and allow for children's textbooks. And that's, and also allow for sort of personalized learning, considering we have a huge issue in quality teaching in India, where people are graduating but not having the real skills. So we have real problems, right? And so this can actually truly be a game changer if we take ownership and, put our minds together and use our context as leverage, right? Good old fashioned frugal innovation, but actually restated for this data age, right?
Yeah. I just want to clarify for our listeners what DeepSeek is in case, some of them are kind of wanting some context. It's basically this Chinese AI company, right, which was very well known for building a powerful open source large language model, which was a rival to ChatGPT. And again, in related to what you were saying later on about small language systems, we're basically, again, here talking about lighter, faster versions of large AI models, right? Which don't require very huge hardware, because they require lesser amount of memory and things like that, while still handling, specific tasks that are allocated to them, just so that
Absolutely.
our listeners have some context. I do hope that, more women definitely come. I really like that point that you made. But it's kind of ironic in this day and age, that we're having these progresses being made and democracy being squished. So I really hope that balance kind of changes a lot more, and kind of transforms truly for the global south. Coming to, the people behind the scenes of this technology revolution, a lot of this work that powers AI, we are looking at people who are very low paid workers, often in the global south. What does this hidden labor reveal about inequality and how this technology is built? You did touch upon it a bit earlier, but could you kind of elaborate a little more on that? I was reading Karen Howe's book recently, and much as it seems obvious that, many of these workers who are kind of checking and, kind of vetting these AI systems, these LLMs, are in developing nations, it was still kind of pretty shocking to hear the kind of wages that they are being paid, which is a pittance and decreasing, over years. So yeah, what do you have to say about this inequality that is created?
Yeah, so absolutely. The very term of automation is actually a real problem, because much of what we do, actually all technologies are intrinsically assistive in nature. It's not automated, because even when we think about the Fordist principles, it's assisting in the larger process of making cars, right? And so the problem with automation is it invisibilizes the labor force, which is indeed, if you look at the way in which even these mainstream media, including The Economist, by the way, frames technology, saying that as well as the global south is, and Africa can be the next test bed for for the technologies. And will Africa get the chance to also leverage on this opportunity? Who's going to carve Africa, right? This kind of rhetoric is really colonial in thinking and opportunistic, right? And the same logic goes also with India. Is India is supposed to be the test bed for use cases, and if you can make it here, you can make it elsewhere. And what that implies is the field, basically, because I've been doing all this field work and I meet with a lot of NGOs, and there's a running joke is that they're suffering from pilotitis. It's too many pilots, which don't actually become something, and it's by design. You pilot something, you as part of an MOU with, say, a government, a state government in India, and then it doesn't matter what the results are. You land up, it's an entry point to get a contract, and then you just dissolve it. So it's almost like it's a sort of soft branding technique. And we've got to get out of this if we want to think in terms of sovereignty. We have the workforce, right? But I do want to make a little bit of a corrective is, in the West, there's so much of concern indeed about, gig work, about the exploitation, but almost in a sort of a very dangerous trend, because there's this rising logic of data colonialism, surveillance capitalism, this, all these are very compelling with this notion that, well, every act we do is, extractive online. We are victims of these big tech. We are oppressed. We are, basically, again, recolonized, which leaves very little room for dignity, but also doesn't give fair sort of attention to what is actually happening in terms of entrepreneurship, creativity, ownership, mobilization, agency. So it seems to me, it smells very white saviorish. And if you see who's behind it, it's a lot of people in the North want to feel good about themselves, right? About, yes, be careful, because if you listen to what content creators are talking about, content, even, people who are sieving through very toxic content moderators,
right. Yes.
labelers, they're not saying take away my jobs. They are saying give us fair work, give us a dignity of conditions, but we want those jobs. Because actually what's happened is my inclusive AI lab has been working with women in India and Bangladesh for years actually, and they're in precarious conditions and they're relegated oftentimes to the house. So this is their way to actually be part of the economy, be part of everyday work, to gain a sense of pride and feel like they're not just so-called a housewife or a caregiver for the parents. And so it's all relatively speaking, but what they do want is, give me better wages, recognize the value of my work, and it shouldn't be the race to the bottom. And you see them collectivizing also, right? Pushing back against these companies, getting on the streets and all, but they're not asking for these jobs to be taken away, which if we follow the Western discourse and these books of fear mongering saying you're so unethical if you do outsource, is basically, it's sort of an entrapment, because then what? Because somebody's got to do that work, right? And so it's not an all or nothing. Recognize that this is a legitimate work, but make it decent work, right?
Right. Fair enough. I mean, it's like you're saying, nobody's saying that, well, these jobs should not be kind of sent to the global south. But like you're saying, do pay the wages they deserve to be paid, and acknowledge that your work is difficult, and definitely not reduce the pay over the years, because that is just plain ridiculous. Because a lot of women, who are working in this space, they are planning their expenses, their EMIs based on this. And then when wages go down, it's disastrous in such situations. One other thing that I wanted to talk to you, Payal, was, when you're talking and the more I watch interviews of people who are founders of these AI companies, there's almost like a messiah-like quality to the way, they're talking about this technology. They frame it as a force that will transform everything. How does that kind of hype shape the way governments and public respond to this technology?
Yeah, so there's a lot of the messiahs out there, like, tech evangelists. And basically, if you look at the AI for good movement itself, and that's a great example, is more than 85% to 90% are coming from not just the US, specifically California. So still the old school mentality is, hey, we have built something for humanity. So it's a feel good for themselves. But AI for good is just AI. I mean, what else is AI supposed to be for? It's supposed to be for good. So it's sort of like a real stupid phrasing, but it's really popular. Is if you see AI for good is for the global south. If it's AI developments for the rest of, the north, right? I mean, all technologies should actually be beneficial for the well-being of human beings, and there shouldn't be these double standards, right? But indeed, these messiahs do, inflate not just their creation, but so they overinflate what technologies are doing, good and bad, and understate what human agency can do in shaping these tools. A classic case in point is I've been doing the sort of a booked circuit and talks around Europe, and I was in multiple, events with Chris Messina, the inventor of the hashtag, who was also, in this social, what was that? There was a documentary about, which created a lot of angst, right? I think the social dilemma, right? And basically, he's like, oh my God, I created the hashtag and now I've destroyed democracy, but don't worry, I'm going to fix it. It's like, you, dude, created the hashtag. Okay, you didn't create democracy and neither did you destroy democracy. So I think people just want to feel very, very important. And they feel that, if I inflate this, then, you have a logic of like, I've created the app that can replace schools, which can replace, I don't know, partners, etc. Because the thing is, it's all about scaling the top so you can get venture capital funding.
Absolutely. I was just going to say that.
Logic.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. No, absolutely. Because a lot of these things ultimately drain a lot of money to set up data centers, to run those data centers. It's a very expensive thing and it's exponential, right? In which case, until you actually market it as being the best thing ever that is for humanity, you're really not going to get that kind of funding, which you need. Because none of these firms are, as far as I know, are actually making any profits, right? I mean, it's going to be a while.
Yeah, it's in Silicon Valley logic. They can go for a decade or so, but that's not happening in the rest of the world. Like if you see entrepreneurship in East Asia to India to etc., they don't come up with this inflation. They talk in much more targeted means. Is like, this is what it can do for, learning. This is the gaps. It's like we need to get boring, right? And the only caveat here is that we give too short a time. We expect instant results, otherwise we get impatient, right? And it's sort of like there has to be a happy medium where people, with new technologies do take time. We need to invest in entrepreneurs. We need to allow them to fail. And so when I say that in the context of the global south, it means very differently from that in Silicon Valley, where it's designed for failure. So we can't export that logic to the rest of the world because they feed on failure and guess who's collateral damage? The global south, right? It's almost like I said, it's a pilotitis, it's the laboratory approach, it's all this stuff. And it's been going on for decades. And so we've got to not replicate the same mode of operation because then we're just doing the same. We need to think in terms of different strategies, in terms of leveraging our own entrepreneur. And we have a lot of good case studies,
Could you share some of those? I mean, that would be actually very useful to know because, we've been talking about the big tech in the United States, in Silicon Valley. Could you give us examples from, the global south, which obviously includes Africa, Latin America, Asia, and Oceania? What are the examples that you could share?
Well, I mean, there's a lot. Like, for example, Lilapa AI in South Africa is this women-led group, which is basically building very targeted apps, which are data light and in multiple languages and dialects in Africa, right? And so it's not even trying to scale. It's trying to create like a diversity and decentralizing of the sort of tools, right? And so that's gaining traction. Or, for example, on a bigger level, Angami, which is the Middle East equivalent of Spotify, has not copied Spotify. It's completely got a very different business model. It immediately pays its creators, unlike Spotify. It doesn't go, and then it also uses AI to also detect where songs are used without accreditation. So it allows AI generated music, but it also uses the same tools and is doing a lot of experimenting in those terms. And it's a Lebanese startup, which actually was interesting. Is also it curates its music differently. Think about Spotify with the world music. What does that mean? World music. It's ridiculous. So you have American music, which has all these genres from blues to rock, etc., and then the rest of the world, right? And so Angami doesn't have world music. It has very specifics in terms of genres, which actually connect, and it's the fastest growing, app, not just in the Middle East, in much of the global South. And we can go on. The fact is that we see opportunity if you are in the global South because you're living these experiences. You have these urgent needs, and again, it's not about scaling infinitely because it's not even sustainable and it may not also be profitable. So I think we've got to think differently. It should be the sort of good enough, sort of model where you're like, firstly, I need to make it more meaningful. I think I can get profit, and I don't need huge venture capital money. Like I was talking to a lot of AI artists and creators, and they basically are saying that, in the past, even a small little film needed at least 10,000, at least in many of the contexts. Now you can actually do it with almost no resources. And
Yes.
It means your story can be told. It means that you can take control of the narrative and you can use that as a way to get funding, right?
Yes.
So with multiple models. So
It actually reminds me. Yeah, it actually reminds me of something that I came across here in India, as somebody who's running an AI model called Adalat AI, which is related to, legal systems in India. And they're basically kind of streamlining the legal systems, making it more automated. And like you rightly said, it has become viable for them to actually create these models, using both open source software as well as, cheaper chips that are needed sometimes to kind of create these systems, right? So that's really interesting. And I just wanted to elaborate a little bit. I was just searching for the names of the companies that you mentioned, Dilapa AI, and just to clarify that, and to say this clearly about how that it is an African AI startup, right? Which is creating tools that understand and work in local languages in education, health, and information. Is that right?
Yes.
And Angami, which is Anghami, is, like you said, a Lebanese music streaming app, which offers Arabic and international songs, right? And it's become like a huge entertainment platform. It's so interesting to hear about these businesses and to see how they're
and not
doing
just
it.
businesses, by the way, it's also policy making. So I was part of this Net Mundial conference, which basically is how you make policy for this AI and data age. And I was in Sao Paulo, and it blew my mind because in India we don't do this, right? What happened is that we, as part of the committee, it was like about 10 of us, sat and for the entire day, while we had everyday businesses, school teachers, civic sector and academics, there were open mics and there were lines, and we just listened and documented all their questions, their concerns, their advice for the entire day. And then we went into a room to draft the updated policy with 2,000 comments, and these were representations of civic organizations, etc. And the first Bill of Rights, which was in Brazil, was made with 2,000 contributions with civic sector. We don't do that. We make policies top down. And I was thinking, wow, the global South the South to South can really learn from each other, and we can be strategic because that's how you make policy. Right. So there's a sort of like, if we don't incorporate voices already at the point of governance, because governance also shapes the digital economy, then however great a technology you build, including, say, tech stack in India, if it doesn't get used, then you have wasted enormous amounts of resources. So it's not even like trying to do good. I mean, I'm not saying politicians, I'm just appealing to the basest instincts of you want to be successful. Then, just being collective, listening actively across sectors, and coming up with new ways of doing things is so fundamental. If you want to keep our national dignity, I'm feeding into all that trope. Sure, embrace the national anthem. Just, just do it right. Involve half your population, the women. Make sure the rural is like listened to. Otherwise, you're going to have street protests for like decades to come. Because people are not quiet. They're very tuned in online. They're online and they're listening and they heard. And they're going to tell their stories and they're going to push forward.
Yeah. No, I think the example that you gave of Brazil is so important. I was reading Sarah Wynne Williams' book, Careless People, which is on Facebook. And there's like so many lines in there which talks about how Facebook was really kind of worried about Brazil because their policies are so clear, they take action. I think Facebook had basically faced criticism for letting misinformation spread unchecked in Brazil, and they were really kind of taken to task for that, So that's interesting that you mentioned Brazil. And really, I mean, you're so right that there is a lot that we can learn from other countries in the global south itself. We really don't have to look to the West for inspiration. Yeah, I mean, you spoke about policymakers too. What are the practical steps you think people, ordinary people, companies, and policymakers, which you addressed briefly, what can they do to make sure that tools like ChatGPT actually serve society in a fair and responsible way? Just to kind of summarize a lot of things that you've addressed, and you've addressed most of these points, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it fundamentally starts with shifting mindsets. Don't look at, inclusion as altruism, like you're doing good. Look at it as common sense if you want to succeed. That's period. If you want your policy to succeed, you want a particular law, you want a particular, app to succeed, think in terms of who are you roping in? How diverse is your data? How versatile, how agile is it? Because then that's a quality data set. Your golden data set, which is a benchmark, should really tap into the diversity, which actually creates resiliency. And so it's not about big versus small, because we've had that conversation before about big data and small data. It's actually really irrelevant because size actually doesn't matter. It's really about the quality data sets. That's one. Second is actually that, I'm very happy to see the amazing amount of momentum geopolitically, because this requires geopolitical solidarity. And why I'm a feminist is because I see feminist principles as truly being the only way in which we can tackle the planetary crisis, because we don't come together as a South-South and not just come together, reform from within. Because we're not like angels, we're not victims, okay? We are also perpetrators by, alienating our own people, by creating tensions and polarization. And so if we can actually genuinely say, bring the women to the table, make sure the socioeconomic angle is taken care of, having people who are young, who are precarious. I mean, look at in Africa, right? Majority of the policymakers are what, 70 something? It's a geriatric kind of rule, and you have the youngest population being ruled. What do you expect but tensions? So do this because, people are ready to get on board, ready to build solidarities. We can do open source, we can do open code, we can share data models. But unfortunately, if we do this with patriarchal systems and authoritarian regimes, then it's not going to work. Because then in comparison, the Western model becomes a better fit. So, let's not go in that direction. And the end of the game is data is not something out there in the cloud, abstract, sort of, it is very much an extension of human beings' aspirations, dreams, personal expression, which is why we need to treat it with dignity, because it's basically human. And if we can remember that, we can start to apply notions of consent. We can know, of dignity and of rights, right, to it.
I mean, that's a great note to end with, Payal. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate this, and for helping us think critically about how, the world of AI, what it's doing to our world, basically, So I hope
Thank you for
we
sharing.
continue to shape AI rather than the other way. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, likewise. And really great questions. And I look forward to maybe a future interaction. Thanks.
Absolutely.